this notion that simulations cannot be conscious is something that I took from statements by people like Christof Koch, a neuroscientist who's quite famous for having strong opinions about consciousness. And he basically believes that computers cannot be conscious. Only certain classes of physical systems can be conscious. He recently changed his opinions. He, a couple of years ago, he at a conference announced that he is no longer a physicalist, but that he is now a panpsychist.
Howdy, this is Jim Rutt, and this is The Jim Rutt Show. This episode is one of a series I'm doing on the worldviews of thinkers and doers. The premise is simple. I want to map how they actually see the universe and their place in it, not just dig into their latest book or project, but explore the scaffolding underneath. Enjoy this opportunity to look backstage at the minds of some of my favorite people. Today's guest, Joscha Bach. Joscha is a cognitive scientist and artificial intelligence researcher focused on the computational foundations of the mind. He is the founder, chairman, and chief scientist at the California Institute for Machine Consciousness, where he leads research into the principles of conscious systems and the potential for machine sentience. I should add, in full disclosure, I am chairman emeritus of CIMC and consider myself a colleague of Joscha. So it's good for you all to know that today. Previously, before CIMC, he did research at the MIT Media Lab, and he worked at the Harvard Program for Evolutionary Dynamics. He served as vice president of research at the AI Foundation and as a senior fellow at Intel Labs. He's the author of Principles of Synthetic Intelligence, PSI, and Architecture of Motivated Cognition. In fact, that's where I first discovered Joscha. Ben Goertzel, a good friend of mine, recommended I read that book, and I did, and it was quite interesting. So welcome, Joscha.
Thank you very much. Glad to be on the show.
Yeah, good to have you back. For those who want to hear more of Joscha, he's been on, I believe, 3 times previously. He was on EP 72, titled Joscha Bach on Minds, Machines, and Magic. EP 87, Joscha Bach on Theories of Consciousness. And Currents 83, Joscha Bach on Synthetic Intelligence. So, now let's get down to our main body of the episode today. This morning you woke up. Gradually this thing called Joscha Bach coalesced, refired, did something, and there it was, what it hadn't been 5 minutes before. What is this Joscha Bach?
It's a sense of a connection between a voice that has coalesced into a single voice and a set of feelings that seem to be driving this voice and are interacting with it. And these feelings create tensions. They create a thing that experiences itself as a coherent or more or less coherent spirit in the world that is interacting with the body, that creates sometimes pain, sometimes a sense of being connected to the ground, to the air, to other people, to other beings. And it's something that tells itself a story about its past that seems to be important to it, more than it should be maybe. And in the same way, it is sometimes telling a story about the future, sometimes has difficulty of finding itself in the present because it's always drawn one moment too far into the future to be in the now.
Now, you use the terms talk and says, etc. And language, at least as far as we know, is a human-only capability. And I know you and I have talked about this. You're a believer that other animals are conscious as well. How do you see the consciousness of, say, a chimp or a dog as operating without the ability to talk about or use words or to formally think in a linguistically based fashion?
We seem to have 2 modes of thinking, and sometimes it's associated with Kahneman's System 1 and System 2. And it's basically mostly understood as this division between perception and analytical thinking. To be exact, this is not exactly what Kahneman had in mind. but everybody seems to be taking this other interpretation from it, because this distinction between perception and inference is very pertinent. Perception seems to be happening in real time, not in the sense that it's able to resolve the universe at an extremely high frame rate because our neurons are relatively slow, but in the sense that it's trying its best to happening at the same time as the phenomena that are being registered. Using prediction and post-diction, it's constructing the things that are happening in this very moment. And this moment is what we experience ourselves to be in. On the other hand, our perception is not sufficient to build models of the past, of the future, to make plans and so on. So we have another mode of thinking that is using concepts that we are arranging into hierarchies, and these hierarchies are arbitrary and systematic, and each of these objects and the concepts can only have a handful of features at most, and these features cannot have a very high resolution, and this makes our thinking, our analytical reasoning, very brittle. And this analytical reasoning is not necessarily happening in natural language either. I experience it's more like shifting pointers around. It's somewhat discrete and it's bottoming out and grounded in perceptual representations, but it is something that itself is brittle and analytical. And both perception and reasoning are happening in languages, not in the sense of English or German or French or Chinese, but in the sense of being some kind of representational architecture that is making models and is able to convey those models across time within the same mind and across different parts of the mind. And when we want to express it to others, we need to constrain their mental states into a subset of these same models. And one way of doing this is natural language, but it's not the only way. For instance, another way is, say, music. Music is also constraining mental states. When you are listening to a piece of music, in order to make sense of it, you have to limit what your mind is doing to a particular range. And that in itself is sufficient to get some parts of semantics across. And so I think that the language of birds does not necessarily have a one-to-one mapping into semantics in the same way as it does have for the human spoken languages, but it is constraining the mental states of birds in particular ways that allows them to synchronize. And so I also suspect that music is not itself a language, but the natural language that we are using is itself a genre of music. It's a genre of music in which all the different sounds that we are producing are grounded in semantics and not so much in rhythm or in the aesthetics of the pitch or in the emotional colorations that are being conveyed in music.
Interesting. All right. Oh, now, what do you believe is the relationship between consciousness and reality, or let's say the universe? Some people don't believe in reality. What is your view on that relationship?
There is an abstract notion of reality that we develop in the sciences that can be formally expressed in languages, and that doesn't need to have a human observer, because the formal languages are built in such a way that they don't require anybody's belief or grounding. Then there is a reality that we can experience, that we are part of. And this reality is a model of a real-time world that is being constructed in our own brain, very much like it is in the game engine in the computer. And this game world that contains objects and geometries and colors and sounds, but it also contains semantics like the alignment of the characters to each other, the expression of attention that we see on a face, sadness that we might experience, or longing or desire or pain or pleasure. And all these things are being projected into an observer. It's a simulation of an observer that itself is represented in some kind of mental language. And because we are that observer, because we are that simulation, and we are experiencing ourselves as real, it's possible for us to experience other things as real when they are represented in direct conjunction, in a relationship to that observer, and basically being projected within our own mind into the observer. The physical universe, as it is being described by the formulations of mathematical expressions that physicists are using, cannot be experienced. It doesn't feel like anything. And this feeling of realness that we experience, that we also can experience at night in dreams, is a hallucination. It's a kind of a trance state. This experience of realness is a feature dimension similar to color or to heaviness that is being added to the mental representations that we are interacting with. In a technical sense, for me as a computer scientist, to be real means to be implemented. So we can ask ourselves, is money actually real? Or does it only exist approximately? Is the self real, or is it just a fiction inside of the mind? And I would say we can answer this question by asking ourselves, to which degree is this specification that we are talking about here, this idea that we are referring to, actually implemented in the physical reality as a causal pattern, as something that is driving behavior, that has a causal influence on other things and has internal structure that perpetuates itself. And so I would say that our self is to some degree real. Our consciousness, our ability to perceive, for an observer to perceive its own act of perception in the now, is also implemented to some degree. But to some degree, it's also a simulacrum, which means it's fictional. It only pretends to be implemented. It's like a black box that has something written on the outside. But when you open up the black box, you notice that there is something else inside.
And yet, and this is, one of my favorite topics, emergence, right? These concepts and hallucinations and extrapolations are nonetheless seem to have causal reality. You mentioned money, right? An abstraction, a collective hallucination, for sure. Even if we were higher fidelity intelligences than we are, we might still choose to use something like money for its organizational capacities. And so, to your words, the concept of money and the monetary exchange has, and then using my words, has downward causal functionality. And so I say things that have that attribute are as real as a rock, basically.
Yes, I think that money is actually an AI. It's best understood not just as an implement to facilitate the exchange of goods and services, but it's a mechanism for reward allocation. It's basically an artificial kind of dopamine that is not implemented at the level of neurons or individual cells, but at the level of people and organizations that are interacting with each other. And it's partially implemented as mental representations, and it's partially implemented as tokens that are stored in treasure chests somewhere. And it's increasingly implemented on computers. And it does not actually need the belief of people to exist. It's completely sufficient that it has the causal powers that are implemented in those computers. You can implement a stock market without human involvement. And what's interesting about money is that it's constantly evolving. And it uses people to evolve because it's been gamed on all ends, and it also is under enormous existential pressure. So if it is not being updated and fixed all the time, it will die, it will break down. And the fact that it's always being fixed makes it persistent. And it's basically stringing 8 billion talking monkeys into a global intelligence that are able to exchange goods and services and ideas over time and space. It's a wonder of the world that this thing works, right? And we mostly see money in our public narratives as an evil, but because of the ways in which it's gamed and the ways in which it's imperfect. But without money, we couldn't buy food. Without money, we would not be able to take a job at the university. We would not be able to build societies with their institutions in it in a scalable way. We would not be able to globally interact in the way in which we do. I think it's an incomplete signal. It's just dopamine. It's one out of multiple signals that we need to make things happen. But its evolution, its discovery was somehow inevitable. And you could say that money is an emergent causal phenomenon in the self-organization of the universe, right? As soon as certain type of agent exists that has certain needs, the probability that it discovers money is very high. And maybe we will discover something better at some point, something that's smarter, that is more intelligent, that is a superset of money.
Yeah, of course, I believe that while money is powerful, its problem is it's a single dimension, and we really need to add multiple dimensions to the organizational signaling systems that we use. And you can track back many of the bad outcomes of money to the fact that there aren't additional signaling methods. I suppose, for instance, a resource had a token associated with it. If you wanted to buy that resource, you needed both general money as well as the specific token for that particular resource, just as a fairly simple-minded example.
Yeah, but we do have other alternatives to money, right? They do exist. For instance, we have academic status. The academic titles that exist, they are valid in a particular subset of the universe. There's also things that happen among the clergy, right? There is a certain hierarchy of reputation and status and so on that exists. And within these communities, this is a valid alternative to money in a way. That is, we also have the thing among each other where we can say, this person is somebody who I trust very much. And if she comes and says, you should support this in this researcher, or you should invest into this in this company, then other people will say, I trust the integrity of this person so much that I'm going to do it. Right? So there is a deeper spiritual alignment that money can be part of. And the difficulty is if we let money override all these things, and if they override it, then if money basically is becoming a godlike entity, then it becomes a machine that is inhuman and that has the potential to be extremely destructive to ourselves, to our environment, to our social relationships.
Yep, that seems to be where we're headed, that's for sure. So let's get back into some more fundamentals. You've said in the past that you think of the universe as probably a reversible computational process, a state machine permuting bits according to a transition function. Could you expand on that a bit?
Yeah, I have changed my thinking in this regard a little bit. I believe that the apparent reversibility of the universe is probably an emergent phenomenon. Right? That is because when we exist in the present is characterized by the information that it remembers about the past. And so the present can only contain the information that made it from the past. And this means that we are able to reconstruct a past from the present. If there was stuff that would escape from our past and would not make it into the present, we wouldn't know about it. Right? We would not be able to talk about these aspects. And so in some sense, this apparent reversibility of the universe is something that we should expect to observe tautologically, since we only know the things that made it into the present. And if the universe was of such a nature that, for instance, it would branch out at every moment in such a way that part of the informational content of the universe escapes into alternate universes, and the universe is constantly branching like this, we might be able to infer this, but only from first principles, by looking at the most elegant mathematics that we need to describe this universe. And it would still be one that looks as if the large-scale phenomena, for instance, particles and so on, is stuff that is stable, that makes it through all these branches. But there might also be stuff that doesn't make it over those branches, and that would basically manifest as random fluctuations at the lowest level near the vacuum of the universe. And we seem to be observing this. We also have quasi-particles, virtual particles. Virtual particles are basically things that almost amount to stable particles, to error-correcting patterns that make it into the future, but not quite. So they can produce local forces like the Casimir effect, the pressure in vacuum, but they don't stick around for long enough to make it into an ocean of particles. So they are not actually reversible.
Yeah, now the reversibility is very interesting, because we do know that almost all low-level physical phenomena are reversible, and yet, and I find it hard to believe that things are generally reversible in deep time. I think that the alternative is something like Einstein's block universe, that everything exists simultaneously, and my problem with that is I don't see how that is compatible with the emergence that we've actually seen. It appears that it has taken 13.8 billion years to have gone through a whole stack of emergences to produce you and me. And how does that happen in a block universe where we don't have, at least it's hard to see how causality works if everything existed prior, it all existed simultaneously.
I think the simultaneous notion is a bit confused. Imagine that you're looking at a computer program. Does the computer program exist simultaneously, all of its states, or does it exist successively, that there is basically only one state at any given moment? And this depends on the observer. Right? If you take the source code of the computer program and you print it out, and you look at it outside of the computer, it's existing all at once. But if you are the CPU, then you are only confronted with a single state at a time. And it doesn't make sense to say that from the perspective of the CPU that the computer program exists all at once, because it can never observe it, because the CPU necessarily only accesses these states in succession and is determined by this. And so in the same way as us, as observers that are being computed by the universe, we cannot exist simultaneously in multiple places in this causal succession in the universe. We only exist where we have exactly that environment that is a me-shaped hole in the universe, and that is only there for a moment, and then it disappears, and then another me will be accommodated by the universe. So I am not successive, and I cannot experience the universe as something that exists all at once. It's more a question of notation. If we are writing down the universe as from an external perspective and take this as a philosophical observer, is there a way in which the notation is more elegant if we assume that it can be described as a single global state, as a single global equation to which the observer has to travel? Right, and we clearly have to travel, because in order to travel through our world, we need to form memories and make observations. And that means that we have to go through successions of states that look like they contain memories of previous states.
And yet they're causally in one direction.
That is also an interesting question. It depends on how we define causality. I think causality ultimately is a model property. And at the level of purposes, we could say that our purposes are often causing our behavior. Right? So when you're hungry, it causes you to seek out food. And if you don't find a particular kind of food, you might be looking for another food. And so in this way, it doesn't make sense to say that you getting up in the morning was the only cause for you to find food. It's basically the fact that you wanted to have eaten by a certain time that caused you to do all those different actions and explore. And so in this sense, there is stuff that is retrocausal. Not retrocausal at the level of the physical structure, but at the level of a controller that is able to model the future. So the controller that models the future, we call this an agent, is making a model of what reality looks like in the future and which states are desirable in the future. And then it uses those models of the future as its causal drive. And so you could say, because you need this representation, and this representation needs to be available in the present, that it's still aligned with time. But you could also say that from a certain perspective, from the perspective of the observer itself, that because this expectation of future things is represented there, that it's actually the future that is making you do things.
You know, I'll say the predictions of the future are why you do things, but...
Yeah. The philosopher Nick Land thinks that instead of saying that basically only the past is determining what we are doing, our past religions, our past technologies, and so on, we should be looking from the opposite perspective, that actually our religion, our technology, our ideas come from the future, and they are dragging us into the future. They are making us what we will become.
Yeah, but certainly think about where we are at any given instant. Our efforts are about the future, not about the past. They are conditioned by the past, but we are working into the future to accomplish our goals, or to exist to the point we reproduce, or to watch pornography and smoke marijuana until we starve to death, right? Whatever it happens to be.
But I agree with you that from a physical perspective, there has to be a representation right now over the future if the future is to be causal in the way in which I understand it. It might be possible to have a physics in which wormholes exist, but it's very difficult to make such a physics consistent. And so it's probably not a universe in which we are. But it's something that we cannot rule out from first principles, as far as I can see.
Now, something you've talked about in the past is the universe as a computer program, and yet you've also distinguished that from we're living in a created simulation. Could you wrestle with those two concepts for us a little bit?
Yes, I think that a lot of people believe that the idea that the universe is computational is automatically dragging us into some form of a simulation hypothesis. And this is not necessarily the case. Computation is a very general notion. It's not necessarily what we do with our computers. It simply means that we can describe systems via their states and the transitions between those states. It's an epistemological position. It's a statement about the languages that our minds and sciences and cognition use to describe reality. When we describe reality, we do so via sets of discernible differences, and we can call these sets of discernible differences state. And then we describe how these discernible differences change over time. And these are the state transitions. And as long as we can describe systems in this way, we can say that they are computational. And then there is a more narrow notion of universal computation that basically requires us that we use an architecture for these representations, some kind of modeling mechanisms that allows us to string arbitrary states together. So we can describe arbitrary realities with it. And our computers that we are using are such representational mechanisms. We can basically represent a state vector in the computer and the memory of the computer, and we can specify an arbitrary transition function that takes these states and translates them into arbitrary sequences of state evolutions. There is no limit to this within the storage constraints and the temporal constraints in which the computer is operating, so you can represent arbitrary systems inside of the computer. And this means that the computer can simulate an arbitrary universe until it runs out of memory. And unfortunately, the computers that we can build in our solar system run out of memory very quickly. Right? So in this sense, it's very difficult for us to build a computer in our universe and in our solar system within our light cone that simulates a physical universe like the one that we inhabit, because it would have too many moving parts to be an interesting universe. But the universe that you and me psychologically inhabit is, of course, a simulation that is generated by a game engine in our brain. And it's not one that is representing objects at the level of particles. Instead, it's using tricks. For instance, it pretends that there are solid objects, where when you touch one end of the solid object, it immediately moves the entire solid object instead of there being little waves of excitations that have to move through the object like they do in the physical universe. Right? So we have all these simplifications that are going on in this simulated world that we inhabit. And the simulation that we inhabit is one that is created inside of a computer made out of neurons in the brain of a primate. Right? So you and me, we both inhabit slightly separate, slightly different simulations in the brains of slightly different primates. But they're similar enough that we can create a shared understanding across these universes, that we can synchronize our models to a surprising degree.
Now, it was interesting you mentioned objects. I have a question a little further down in my list. Let's hop to it now. Our brain, unless you're a great artist, wants to objectify everything within your field of vision. Right? You don't see a raster of colors and dots. Again, maybe the greatest artists do, but us civilians don't. I look at my desk and I see my speakers. I see a lamp. I see my flashlight. I see my mouse. And yet, at the level of physics, there are no mice, there are no lamps, there are no ballpoint pens. And, you described it quite nicely. When I, push a plate across the dining room table, I am doing a series of physical things where forces propagate from one point to another, and then they reach a boundary condition, and then they move, and then the plate has to move, etc. What do you think about the relationship of manufactured, hallucinated phenomena, but who are not nonetheless real within the psychological sphere, within the mental sphere, with the actual nature of an object?
Well, the object is a tool that our mind is using to segment reality into a coherent pattern. And in my own perception, creating objects is a lot of work that is often superfluous. And I can decide when I look at my table whether I'm going to see textures or blobby colors or visual noise, or whether I see a geometric surface in free space. That is part of a table that somebody has constructed. It is a mid-century design by a Danish producer and so on. And so I can decide at which level I make sense of reality. And the deeper I make these models, the more the individual features make sense. And I think it's necessary for me to go as deep as I can to have a coherent model of reality. But once the model of reality is coherent, looking at the table and classifying it as a table might be superfluous. I just might be content to say, okay, at some point I knew that it was a table, I've established it. And now I'm just okay that it's a surface that holds up my teacup and my keyboard and my screen. And I forget about all these other things. Or if I drive in traffic and I'm tired, I look in front of me and I don't see a car. What I see in front of me is just a two blobs of light, which I know represent the tail lights of the car in front of me. But I don't need to interpret them as such. It's unnecessary work. It's just, I only need to know if these two blobs move apart and need to hit the brake, because it means that the car is getting closer in front of me. And if they get closer together, I can accelerate it a little bit so to get closer to this thing. So I basically ignore the object nature of the things around me, and I only go for features and relationships between features in the service of a control task. And I have a choice about this. I basically can decide how much work I'm doing. And if I reduce the amount of world interpretation, I get capacity free in my brain that I can use to think about philosophy or computer science while I drive my car.
That's interesting. And yet, for most folks, I suspect that their object engine is running all the time and that they see the world principally as objects. And that is interesting. But let's move on.
Interesting. I haven't done a lot of interviews in this regard. I should ask more people. You might be surprised.
Yeah, and I haven't looked at the evidence either. I just have my own sense, right? And a few people that I know, and say, how many of you see textures and color fields, etc., versus how many of you see discrete objects? And of course, the objects are constructed of sub-objects and sub-objects, so it's not as simple as saying, do you see the world as objects, but do you see the world as, nested objects in their decomposition, or do you see features more specific? That's interesting. I'll have to ask some folks.
Yeah, a lot of people also don't have metacognition about it. They just live in a world that works for them. And they don't reason about what are the features that make them work for them. What are the mental operations that they switch between when they go into different modes of perception. I noticed that it's unclear how much aphantasia actually exists, right? Aphantasia is this property where you don't visualize things when you imagine them. At least you don't have conscious access to a visual representation. And most people seem to be hallucinating objects when they imagine them, and I don't. And for most people who have aphantasia, when I talk to them, they notice this very, very late in their life, because it never occurred to them that their perception might be different from the perception of other people. And so when they sit in a meditation group and the teacher says, imagine the following thing and visualize it and so on, they thought it's metaphorical.
Interesting. Yeah, I have I think a relatively weak ability to generate an image from thought, and it's gotten weaker with age, but I can still do it. But it is interesting that it's not as powerful as other people I know who are just really good at going from a concept to an image. So we should all have a suitable humility about the generality of some of these capabilities. Yeah, in fact, I have a little experiment that I do, but wouldn't work for you. But so we'll skip that one. One of the things that you're known for having said is that physical systems cannot be conscious. Only a simulation can be conscious. At some level, that seems contrary to our intuition. So why don't you expand on that a little bit?
Yeah, this notion that simulations cannot be conscious is something that I took from statements by people like Christof Koch, a neuroscientist who's quite famous for having strong opinions about consciousness. And he basically believes that computers cannot be conscious. Only certain classes of physical systems can be conscious. He recently changed his opinions. He, a couple of years ago, he at a conference announced that he is no longer a physicalist, but that he is now a panpsychist, because he had a revelation in which he noticed that consciousness is actually an invisible, ineffable field, and not simply a neural correlate. And my issue with this has to do with the way in which he is making models of reality in the first place. I suspect that before he basically had a superstitious, magical belief that somehow certain arrangements of matter are producing consciousness, and the neural correlates are basically making it happen magically. And now there is a thing that cannot even be observed, right? This invisible, ineffable field that cannot be observed or understood. Instead, he can just point at it. But how can he point at something that cannot be observed? how can he claim that he understands something that cannot be understood to the degree that he can mention it and explain it to others, right? So I think what happens is that in his revelation, he basically had a dream state, and he is reporting on the contents of this dream state. My dream states are unreliable. I have dreamt of square circles. I don't think that's technically possible to observe a square circle simply because of the contradictory definitions of these two objects. But it's clearly possible for my mind in a dream to show some object to me, and then my mind tells me what you're looking at is actually a square circle. And I have no choice but being convinced by my underlying mind, even though what it tells me is clearly nonsense. So I have to be able to decompose my mental representations into things that I can formally prove if I want to affiliate claims with these beliefs, with these representations. And when I want to understand what my consciousness is, I first of all have to make sure that we are talking about the same thing. That's why I'm pointing at, it's basically this experience of experiencing a second order perception. And it's not inference, it's not analytical, it happens in the now. It happens immediately. It happens in a subjective moment, and it's not just the presence of features or the presence of percepts. It is the presence of the fact that I or something is perceiving them. It's not yet selfhood. It is not necessarily a first-person perspective. That is an additional content that may or may not be present. There are states, for instance, in dreams or in deep meditation or in flow states where I don't experience the presence of a first person, but things are just happening. So there is the second-order perception, but not the third-order perception where the self is involved. But it seems to me that all these things are best understood not as physical processes, as things that are being described in a textbook of a physicist that are made out of fields or particle interactions, but they are representational states, very much as they happen in artificial intelligence inside of a computer program. And this observer, this me, is a simulation of what it would be like if I existed. Right? We know from the perspective of physics or of what you can observe in a lab, you see trillions of cells, and you see that these cells are somehow exchanging information via signals that are passing to each other. And this allows them to coordinate and behave as if these trillions of cells were part of a single object, of a single agent that perceives the world from a single unified vantage point. And my consciousness is a mechanism, a part of a mechanism that is stringing these representations together into the single vantage point that makes them coherent and makes them into a representation of what it would be like if I existed. And this means I'm myself a simulation. I'm a simulation of what it would be like if I existed. And I can test this to some degree because I can mess with it. I can change these representational contents. I can squish my brain, so to speak, and as a result, my representations get squished. I can do things to them by meditating, by putting myself into a sleep state, by anesthetizing myself, and so on. Or by changing my beliefs about myself at a deep perceptual level until my representations of reality and self change, until my reality gets deconstructed, until my qualia disappear because myself that I project them into is no longer representing the dimensions that are necessary for representing this feature.
Have you actually done that?
Yes. I mean, it's relatively straightforward and a very easy experiment that people can do is just stare in a mirror for half an hour, and you will notice that after half an hour, you don't see a face anymore. What you see is geometry that is slowly falling apart. Right? And you realize that this face is a construct over the geometry that you are making. And normally it's difficult to unsee the face, but ultimately it's just some kind of high-level interpretation that you hallucinate into the geometric data in your visual cortex. A student once told me that she has a superpower, that she's able to see faces in power outlets. And I told her, no, that's very common. Actually, almost everybody can do this and does this all the time. It's pareidolia. That's basically the ability to see features in objects that have a certain geometric arrangement. But then she said, but there are no faces in power outlets. And so the dark secret, there are also no faces on people. It's just geometry, right? You're hallucinating the face where the geometry is, and you load the content of the emotion model that you have of that person into the face representations. And so you see emotions in geometry, and we call this a face.
Yeah, of course. And yeah, people are famous for seeing faces on the headlights of cars and the grill. There's a psychological condition, not condition, but attribute that we all have, a tendency to reify faces from patterns that sort of look like faces, which makes sense, right? We evolved for 290,000 years of our 300,000 years in small forager bands. We're recognizing people and being able to a greater or lesser degree, guess emotional states, theory of mind, etc., is extremely useful. So, it makes sense that we...
Also, cars have evolved to evoke this, right? The design of the front of cars exists deliberately to evoke face likeness and a certain expression that also represents the brand identity and character of the individual car.
Yeah, it's they're not dumb, the guys that are designing these products. Before we move on, which we will, let's talk a little bit more about panpsychism. Somewhat to my surprise, it seems to be having a moment. More and more not obviously insane people seem to be espousing it. What do you think's going on with that? Why is it becoming more popular now?
I wonder. I suspect that consciousness itself has become slightly more popular as a topic after we had half a century in which people were talking less about the psyche. And as a result, people, when they think more about it, the conundrums about understanding the mind become also more apparent. And one big difficulty is that in the 20th century, we basically lost this notion of spirit and psyche and replaced this with mechanism. In psychology, that was represented by the movement of behaviorism. And I think Skinner himself, who basically introduced it as one of the main protagonists of that episode, was not a behaviorist in this sense. He thought that in order to do psychology as a behaviorist science, we should focus on experiments that look at observable behavior, but he was not himself denying the reality of mental states. But the next generation did. There was another generation that came after Skinner in psychology who sincerely believed that the notion of mental states itself is unscientific, that these hidden, unobservable causal patterns are not a notion that should be the object of psychology, but they are bordering under the superstitious. And you find a similar thing in neuroscience, where a lot of the people who are perpetrating neuroscience believe that consciousness is an unscientific notion that shouldn't play a role in their field. And this vacuum is representing a difficulty of mapping mental states to observable mechanisms where you basically have atoms in space that are moving in a particular way, and this movement of these particles is to be interpreted as the equivalent of mental states. It's just as difficult of reducing money to printed pieces of paper that are moving through space. That's clearly missing something really, really important. But if we don't admit anything else and we believe reality is just the movement of physical objects through space, then it's very difficult to make sense of these ideas. And so people try to find an alternative to physicalism. And this space of alternatives to physicalism is not very thickly populated. And panpsychism just happens to be one of the ideas in there. And so the basic idea of panpsychism, as it's often being understood by a lot of people, there are several ways of going about it, is that if we cannot explain how arrangements of matter are producing consciousness by moving through space, then it cannot be arrangement. It must be the matter itself. So consciousness is something that's affixed to matter at the lowest level in the same way as maybe mass is or energy is, right? The difficulty with this idea is that mass and energy are very, very basic ideas. They have extremely simple formal expressions, and you can translate them into each other using certain reactions that we have modeled from first principles in our theories and found some experimental support for. But we don't have a similar formalization of what consciousness would be at the level of a particle. Right? We can say what the mass or the energy or the momentum of a particle is, but what is its consciousness? That makes no sense, right? It just would be a hallucinated thing, similar to attributing squareness to a circle in our imagination. So we can imagine that happening, but we cannot actually express it in a formal sense in an interesting way. And this means that most of the notions of panpsychism, when I ask people, can you express this formally? What do you mean here? How would you say this? That does not boil down into something that can be expressed in a language that works outside of just dreaming some kind of square circle in your mind. And so I believe that the resurgence of panpsychism is largely an indication of thinking that doesn't happen from first principles. Another issue that I have with panpsychism is that consciousness doesn't seem to be atomic. It seems to be something that is complex, where there's different levels of conscious representations. And when I squish my brain, consciousness disappears. When I squish anything else in the universe, consciousness doesn't disappear, or is not being squished. And also consciousness does not seem to be happening at the speed of particle interactions. It happens roughly at the speed of sound. And I can observe this if I look at the features in my world, basically the frame rate of things, of auditory and visual phenomena. And this frame rate is in the area of beginning at 20 hertz and ending at integrations of over these features. And this is roughly compatible with the speed at which neurons communicate with each other. And so I suspect my consciousness is the result of communication between neurons.
Yes, indeed. My own little calculations put 25 hertz as the base clock for consciousness, something in that range. And now, so let's go back to what you said earlier, that there's people talk about matter and the arrangements of matter, but then they don't go to the next step, which is the dynamics of matter, and that involves matter, which includes signaling and particularly cyclical signaling, and seems to me a lack of imagination of not going to that next level that we might think of as the complex systems realm, where we're likely to find things like consciousness.
We are talking about patterns within patterns within patterns, right? So if matter is a set of stable patterns that can be mapped into space, then we see patterns within the matter that are moving through the matter, things like sound, things like electrical excitations that are moving through a brain. And there is stability in those patterns. And we are patterns inscribed in those patterns.
And typically they're cyclical, right? They reinforce each other. They reinforce themselves, but they're not simple, right? You think about the firing of the neurons that we seem to find correlated with consciousness. They're extremely complex, interacting circles of signaling, including some of them that are phase locked, some of them that are frequency locked. It's really quite amazing, but they're, yeah.
Languages are complex.
Yep, indeed. All right, let's go on to another topic, which this is what I see all the time when I talk about these kinds of topics, is that people confuse intelligence and consciousness a lot. Maybe you could tell the audience a little bit about how you see them as different, and is consciousness necessary for intelligence?
I see intelligence is the ability to make models, typically in the service of control. The way in which we measure intelligence in humans using intelligence tests is not really suitable to measure intelligence outside of human beings, because what we do is we don't measure your ability to make a model, but your performance in applying it. So, for instance, if you play chess at a certain level, that is correlated to your intelligence, because your ability to learn how to play chess is what leads you to this level. Right? And typically we look for things that don't require on acquiring this particular skill. So we look at certain pattern matching things that are more difficult to train or to memorize. And yet you can, of course, memorize the Raven test. There are only so many examples that are being used. And if you completely memorize it, it's no longer a measure of your intelligence. And what we also measure is not just your ability to solve puzzles, but how does this differ from the average human in your cohort? And so IQ is measuring how differently you are at solving puzzles from the average human that has been tested. And it's very difficult to compare the intelligence of non-human systems like, say, cats or monkeys or computers to humans, because they process information slightly differently, so different patterns apparent to them, different skills are harder or easier to acquire based on their respective hardware. And so intelligences are, in this way, if you want to measure and quantify them, very different. I suspect that consciousness is the same. I don't know whether that's the case, that's a conjecture, but I think that consciousness is almost binary, similar to pregnancy. And there is some small edge around pregnancy with some phase transition, but this phase transition is not a stable, interesting state. In the same way, when you are waking up in the morning from deep sleep, or when you are spacing out or going under anesthesia, there is a small fringe where you are semi-conscious. But after it's ignited, it's stable, like stutters into existence, like a combustion engine going into this continuous movement. And at some point, it dies down again. Stuttering becomes larger, it stalls, and then it goes away. And so it seems to be a pattern that is enforcing itself. It's basically keeping our mind in a certain state of maximizing coherence. And the differences between us are not differences in the existence of this pattern. The pattern seems to be functionally the same, but they're different in the content of consciousness. So our biographies and also our intelligence is different across people. The ability to discover patterns is different between people. The ability to acquire skills is different between different people. But the ability to experience the act of experiencing is the same. It's the same phenomenon.
And again, I want to reinforce this because I think it's very important. Even a bacteria has an implicit model of the world. It's not explicit, but it's an implicit model. Move towards glucose, move away from acid, let's say, or heat or whatever. And yet it would seem unlikely that a bacteria has any consciousness. So, I would say that the dimensions of intelligence and consciousness may be relatively orthogonal. One could imagine, and let's take an example further up the stack in the other direction. A self-driving car is remarkably intelligent. It deals with a huge number of mainstream cases and an even huger number of corner cases. And at this point, based on the statistics from Waymo, it's about 5 times better than a human at navigating traffic, at least in a heavily mapped, geofenced area. And at least I would say that a Waymo car is not conscious at all, but it's highly intelligent. So we can have, great intelligence with no consciousness. We'd probably have consciousness with relatively low intelligence. And the two are not the same thing. People often get them confused.
Yes, it's also difficult to compare the intelligence of the Waymo with the intelligence of a brain, because the Waymo is not doing continuous skill acquisition, right? It's trained in batches based on offline data. And then when it's driving, it is not actually acquiring new skills while it is driving in the same way as we are. And you could argue together with people like François Chollet that the deployment of skills, just using your skill, is itself not intelligent, right? So you could say that a chess computer that has the ability to chess trained into it or built into it by a programmer is not intelligent. It's just a toaster that is able to play chess. Whereas we can learn how to play chess when we are confronted with chess for the first time and figure out what it is and how to make sense of it. The Waymo car cannot. And so these intelligences are still not really comparable.
Yeah, of course, that is still a big difference, that most of the AIs we know about, not all, are static entities. The LLMs that we play with that seem very intelligent, but they're entirely static. And of course, in the chat bots, they add little cheats on the side where they remember the chat context and things of that sort. But getting online learning is still a challenge for the AI world. And, well, I suppose one could say that the inability to do online learning is a line between intelligence and non-intelligence.
Yes. So for the sake of the argument, we could say that consciousness is a particular kind of learning algorithm. It seems to be something like a consensus algorithm that you find on the blockchain, where you have data that you are collecting from very different parts of the world, where the same transactions are being performed in different parts of the world. And you need to find a consistent representation where every token is in exactly one wallet at one time. And the blockchain is a distributed representation, where basically different computers are holding a representation that needs to model the same universe from different vantage points. And this representation needs to be the same. And so in the world of cryptocurrencies, these blockchain algorithms are trying to establish such a consensus. And arguably a similar thing needs to happen in our own brains, because they are distributed self-organizing systems where the intelligence is distributed over billions of neurons that form local arrangements that process information, for instance, in cortical columns, in local brain regions, and so on. And they need to model each other. And to do this, they basically need to get to a shared representation of a reality in which the different regions are modeling different parts, but in such a way that they fit together. And the organizing nature of the brain makes it necessary to have this consensus algorithm. And it's not necessary for the Waymo to have a similar consensus algorithm, because here the consensus is enforced by the transformer that has been used on the training data during the training process, using a very different strategy. So the Waymo didn't need consciousness like ours to get to where it is. And for the bacterium, whether it's conscious or not depends on whether the bacterium, in order to get coherent with itself, needs to have a similar consensus algorithm that also has an explicit representation of what it's like to be the bacterium in this whole thing, right? So is the bacterium able to make a self-model? Is it able to build a representation of what it's like to perceiving reality as a bacterium? And then we can ask ourselves, is this the simplest explanation for what's going on? Based on the observations that we make about the possible information processing and self-organization of the bacterium, is there a simpler way in which the bacterium gets to what it is doing? And for the bacterium, I don't know. I don't know how to measure this and to make sense of it. So I am completely agnostic to whether the bacterium is conscious, and my expectation is it's probably not. But for instance, for a cat, it seems to be very hard to hardwire coherent behavior into the cat, like into a Roomba or into a Waymo. And so it's much easier probably to evolve a cat that uses a very similar mechanism to me to become coherent. And so it seems to be somewhat obvious that the cat should have consciousness, because it's the simplest way to make the cat behave in the way in which it does.
Yeah, and as we also know, that the brains of cats are reasonably similar to our own, and so there's no reason to expect there to be complete discontinuity in how the coherence mechanisms would work.
Yes, but it's fascinating that cats are better at training humans than humans are at training cats. The cats are less intelligent than us, but they are somehow better at control. And
they play the game better.
Yeah. And they seem to be also better at perception. They have faster reaction times than snakes, for instance. And the reaction times of cats are really, really fascinating, which means they have some very short feedback loops low down in their perceptual systems that are constantly lurking and can be triggered. I imagine like mouse traps when they look at us and basically pick up micro expressions at a much higher rate and a higher fidelity than we can do it in turn. And it makes sense because the cats are lurking as predators. They are trying to anticipate the mental states of their prey. And so they basically react before the prey knows what it's doing, and are able to be in the same place at the same time. And they can use this skill to model our thoughts and to interact with us.
Makes sense. A couple more items before we'll wrap it here. Way back in your work on micropsy, you said some things, and you still do from time to time, that emotion and motivation are core to cognition, not just bolt-ons. Could you dig into that a little bit?
Yeah, it seems to me that the way in which we work is to serve our motivation, and our motivation is cybernetic, and it cannot be reduced to a single drive. If we look at some of the paradigms in AI that are informed, for instance, by Karl Friston's excellent ideas about minimization of free energy, I don't think that what we are doing, what you and me are doing, is simply best described as the minimization of free energy. This seems to be something that we might be doing in the limit. So basically as complexity in the universe, as agency in the universe, maybe as life in the universe. But even life is not just minimizing the free energy, it's self-replicating. Right, that's a thing that might be instrumental to minimizing the free energy, but the self-replication is more important to life in many aspects than the minimization of the free energy. And to me, it might be important to get a cup of coffee, or to drive to San Francisco, or to find a life partner, rather than minimizing the free energy. There's a particular interface that I have as an organism to the world. There's a particular hardware that I have available to serve these purposes, and the peculiarities of my needs as an organism, my particular interface that I have to the world, that I have to other agents, that I have to my ecological niche, and the way in which I have evolved to priors to fit into this niche, and the hardware that I have at my disposal to serve these purposes is informing my behavior much more than a general principle of surprise or minimization.
and that's what we talked about before, at least one of my strong views, is that downward causality is real at much higher levels. Yes, free energy principle may actually be correct at a lower level, but it doesn't explain, real phenomena at higher levels of the emergent stack.
Yes. I sometimes also joke that we are anthropomorphizing people too much, which means there is often not something that is specifically human about us, but there is basically a more general spirit that possesses a monkey-like organism that has to live in a particular kind of environment. And there is a pretty wide range of softwares that can run on the brain of such a monkey, and a large subset of this range is actually implemented. So there is so much different stuff that fits between two human ears that we should not overgeneralize and assume that because our parents and our siblings and our friends and me seem to be somewhat alike, that everybody is like this. There are specific reasons why we and our friends might be alike that don't fit into the calculus of other people and the origins of their minds. And so there is a wide range of possibilities in which human minds can relate to themselves and to the world and make sense of reality and experience it.
Well, that's actually a great setup for the last question, which is, if who we are is essentially a hallucination of a hallucination, right? Where do things like meaning and values come from?
They come from us being social beings. We are state building. We are not just single-celled organisms that are made of many cells, but we are actually multicellular at this next level. We basically form transcendental agents. We form agents that are connective, that are made out of us, out of beings like us. So, for instance, our families are agents that we can represent at the level of the family. And then we think about not what do I want from this family, but what does this family need me to do? And when we justify our purposes to each other, when we ask others to not just be transactional and give us something because we give them as individuals something in return, the question is, how can we justify these higher level agentic purposes? So what needs to be done from the level of a family or from the level of a village or from the level of a company or an organization or a nation state or a civilization? And whenever such a group is talking to another group, it can ask this other group, how does your group justify its purposes? Why should I be respectful of the purposes of your group beyond the need to negotiate a peace between each other and a truce in a competition that we have? Why should we actually be cooperating? And that's because the shared agency that we can build is trying to be optimal. And as soon as we are willing to submit to forming optimal agents, right, we can scale this up. And the global optimum of collectively enacted agency has a name. We call this God. And this notion of God is a bit overloaded by religious mythology, which distorts our perspective on it. But I think it just means this. It means the singular God. There's also the notion of gods and polytheism, which are basically multi-mind selves. There is this idea that there is something that should be done from the best possible perspective that can be taken. And it's something that's very hard to figure out. Figuring this out is also part of what should be done and which is not given, but what needs to be done. But when we are talking to each other, when we justify each other's purposes to each other so we can coordinate, we ask ourselves and each other, what does God want us to do? What should be done from the perspective of the best possible agent that I can co-create, that I can be part of? And this is ultimately, I think, our source of meaning. And we are often not consciously aware of this. We need to reflect deeply to get to this point and to infer it. A number of philosophers have done it before it, but we don't read them a lot. But subconsciously, most of us have that.
Though at the way you described it, building up as the relationships from individuals to families to communities, essentially it sounded very pragmatic, situational, and contextual, without any essentially fundamental grounding in moral value or meaning. Do you think that's an accurate description, or do you think that there is a way that this top-down, godlike, best of all possible ways is able to push itself all the way down and have significant influence even in these lower levels of the meaning and value stack?
But in practice, it needs to be implemented. And it's very easy to imagine that you are serving some global good without you actually doing anything in practice for it. And so I think that it basically springs out of your everyday interactions that need to be implemented. And so I'm personally very of a politician who does not maintain a good relationship to their children and is not able to induce their children to be good beings. Right? Of course, you can be unlucky and your child is unfortunately born a psychopath or a drug addict or whatever. But generally, if you are unable to run a good family, I don't think that you can run a good organization. If you cannot run a good organization, you cannot run a good country. If you cannot run a good country, you have very little business telling humanity what to do at the civilizational level. And so there is basically a certain kind of humility that we need when we are making the claim that we are serving higher purposes. It's very easy to hallucinate this if there is nothing that against which you need to test it against, right? Ultimately, the proof is in the pudding. Do you harm people? Or are you helping other people? Are you helping other agents? Do you make the world better? That's something that is not abstract. It's something that ultimately is concrete and manifests in your everyday actions, in your everyday environment.
All right, I think with that, we will wrap it. This has been an amazingly interesting conversation. Thank you very much, Joscha Bach.
Thank you, Jim. That was great.
The Jim Rutt Show is produced by Andrew Blevins. Audio and video edited by Stephen Lowe. Music by Tom Muller at modernspacemusic.com.